Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome everyone to our translation studies class. So this is our second lecture of this course, and our today's topic is translation methods and skills. So in this lesson today, first we will see some varieties in translation, and then we will see different methods that are employed in translation, and in the end we will talk about some of the important skills that are essential or important for a translator. The basic function of translation has been to transfer written or spoken text of the source language to the equivalent written or spoken text of the target language. So this is the basic purpose of translation. So in general, the purpose of translation is to reproduce various kinds of text. So this is another purpose, to reproduce various kinds of text through translation, in which what's included is it includes religious text, literary text, scientific text, and philosophical text in another language, to make them available to wider readers. Since all languages have different ways of structuring words and grammar in order to express the same ideas, translations often reflect the structure of either the source language or the target language. Source language bias results from following the form of the source language too closely, and therefore reflecting source language form and grammar tendencies in the target language, which is translation. So when the form of the source language is followed too closely, so it results it reflects the source language form and grammar tendencies in the translation. On the other hand, the opposite problem, the target language bias, occurs when we translate so freely into the target language that we lose some of the meaning of the source text. So because here, when we are target language biased in our translations, so we are so free in translation, we translate so freely that we ignore some important things, important meanings that which are there in the source text. So we just ignore them and we lose them in the final product of translation. So in this case, we can imagine a spectrum where there are translations with the strong source language bias and translations with strong target language bias. As the language bias in translation is always observable. This is a fact. Whenever you see a translation, you will see some sort of bias, whether it's a source language biased translation or it is a target language biased translation. So on the extreme of source language bias, what we find literal translation, a translation in which the words of the source text are quite literally transferred into the target language without much consideration for how naturally they sound in the target language. So here in the source language bias, so there is literal translation, and in literal translation, so the words of the source text are quite literally transferred into the target language. So there is no consideration for how naturally they sound in the target language. So we do not think much about the target language. Our main focus is on the source text, and we just focus on the form and structure of the source language and source language biased translation. And as it is well known, this would break the golden rule of translation. What's the message? What's the rule? That is, message has priority over form. So, but here, what we do not care for the message, but we care for the form. We care for the form of the source language here. We don't care for the message, we ignore it. So, in this way, we are breaking this golden rule of translation. All right. So, on the opposite extreme, which is target language bias, so it occurs when there is free translation. So when there is free translation, so target language bias occurs. So in this case, translators takes the liberty to mold the text so much to the target language that the message of the source text may be augmented or distorted. So here, translator is very free. So he is, he takes so freedom, and he molds the text so much to the target language that the message of the source text may be augmented or distorted. Sometimes because his main focus is on the target language form and structure, so he doesn't care much about the source text. So in this, what result? The result comes that sometimes it may the translation may be augmented or distorted. I mean, the message of the source text may be augmented or distorted. So again, so this is not the objective of our translation operation. So this would be counterproductive to our purpose in translation. So we do not translate to distort the message of the source text, of course. Alright, so we have two extremes now. One is literal translation in source biased translation, and the other one is free translation and target language biased translations. So between these two extremes, we can imagine an infinite number of degrees. There may be many points, okay, but it is helpful, it's imperative or more helpful to identify only several points of reference, so that we can measure the degree of source language or target language bias in translation. I mean, how can we measure the degree? How much bias of source language or how much bias of target language is there at this point? So this way, if we identify several points of reference, I mean, this would be much helpful for us to identify the degree of source language or target language bias in translation. The coming up diagram, next slide. So you can see there 5 possible points on this spectrum. So here on this spectrum, you can see on the left side there is source language bias, and on the right one there is target language bias. So the extreme of source language bias translation is literal translation, and extreme of target language bias translation is free translation. And in between these two extremes, there are 3 more referenced points: faithful translation, balanced translation, and idiomatic translations. So they can be described like this. I mean, literal, let's see. What does it mean? Literal uh, translation closely mirrors the structure of the source language. Closely mirrors the structure of the source language. So thus this action, this approach, when you closely mirror the structure of the source language, it results in making the translation difficult to understand and possibly distorting the message of the source text. How come? I mean, when you are focusing only on the source text and you are producing a translation in a target text, and the target text reader is unaware of the form and structure of the source text, so that's why uh, so reading for him will be difficult and understanding the message for him will also be difficult. Faithful translation shows source language bias with some compensation for the target language. Here there is a little difference. This is also, I mean, source language biased translation, the faithful. This also focuses the form and structure of the source language. But anyway, I mean, it gives some sort of to a little extent the compensation for the target language. But even though, I mean, it may sound unnatural to the target reader, because most of the focus of faithful translation is on the source language, so this may sound unnatural to the target language reader. Balanced translation displays structure from both the source language and target language. So in balanced, we have here both involvement of the both languages, so the structure and form of both the source language and the target language. The message is reasonably comprehensible, so there is some sort of a balance here. So I mean, both forms and structures, both forms of both languages are considered in this translation, so message is reasonably comprehensible. After this, we have there the idiomatic translation. So idiomatic translation follows the structure of the target language. So it follows the structure of the target language. That means this is target language biased. So, and it sounds natural while communicating the exact message of the source text. So it sounds natural because it's target language biased. So when you read the translation of idiomatic translation, so it will definitely be felt like a natural translation, I mean natural English or a natural target language. Next is free translation. It follows the structure of the target language so much here. So here it follows the structure and form of the target language so much that a part of the message of the source text may be changed or distorted. So here, so the one eye of the translator is closed, which is on the left side towards the source language. So he closes his eyes from the source language, let's say, and he just looks at the right with his right eye on the target language, and he feels free. So what's the negative point in this? That some part of the message of the source text may be changed or distorted. So here we have just discussed some of the degrees of translation. I hope this will be very helpful to understand the translation process. And now we are moving. So here we have a list of some of the methods, some of the commonly used methods. Actually, there are so many number of methods that are used in translation field, but we have selected just a few here, in which there are word for word translation, literal translation, faithful translation, semantic, adaptive, free translation, idiomatic, and communicative translation. Word for word translation. So word for word translation or literal translation is the rendering of text from one language to another, one word at a time, with or without conveying the sense of the original text. So listen again. So word for word translation is the rendering of text from one language to another, one word at a time, with or without conveying the sense of the original text. So here, so sense, maybe it conveys the sense of the original text, or maybe it doesn't. So but in this process, translation occurs word by word at a time. So word for word translation takes no account of the context and preserves the word sequence of the source language. So it takes no account of the context, but it preserves the word sequence of the source language. So word sequence is important here. So what word comes after what word. So this order is kept in this process. The source language word order is preserved, and the words translated by their most common meaning. Moreover, so apart from the word order preservance, so the translation is also done uh, by their most common meanings. The most common meaning that are taken or that are in use, they are taken for those words, and cultural words are translated literally. The main use of this method is either to understand the mechanics of the source language, or to construe a difficult text as pre-translation process. So before doing a translation of some text or paragraph like this, there is a process, a pre-translation also. First you translate difficult words, and then you try to understand the sense of the text. And this process of word for word translation process is also used uh, to construe a difficult text as a pre-translation process also. So in this way, for difficult text, so they are translated before the main translation as well. So in translation studies, literal translation is often associated with scientific, technical, technological, or legal texts. Right. So here we will see here some of the negative points of word by word, word for word translation process. So this process is often considered a bad practice of conveying word by word translation in non-technical texts. In technical texts, we just saw that this is practical there, but for non-technical text, it's considered a bad practice. This process usually refers to the mistranslation of idioms. Okay, for the translation of idioms also, this is not considered a fit uh, method. So because that affects the meaning of the text, making it unintelligible. I mean, I think you will agree with this straightforward, because when you literally translate idioms, I mean, they do not give the meaning, what idioms actually mean. And the concept of literal translation may be viewed as an oxymoron. So contradiction in term means, I mean, that is very different or opposite meaning what the source text means. So when you translate it word by word, it may give opposite meaning of the source text, or very strange or different meaning than the actual meaning of that word in the source text. So usage here, so the use of word for word translation, we see here, we have here a word for word translation can be used in some languages and not others, depending on the sentence structure. So depending on the sentence structure, in some languages word for word translation can be used, and in some languages it cannot be used. For example, here we have this actually this line or this sentence, like el equipo esta. Really, I can't read it, but you can try anyway. You can try this. This is language. This is actually Spanish. Okay, so this Spanish. So when you will translate this word by word, okay, so it would translate into English as the team is working to finish the report. Okay, and by the way, I also put this line into Google Translate and it gave me this translation. So team report को ख़त्म करने के लिए काम कर रही है. The team is working to finish the report. Okay, I think it's a similar. Okay, it's a similar to the English. So English, Spanish, and Urdu here are similar, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It depends on the sentence structure. For example, the Spanish sentence above, so this sentence above, could not be translated into French or German using this technique, because the French and German sentence structures are completely different. So here it worked with Urdu amazingly, so I'm happy anyway. And it worked with Spanish as well, but this will not work in other languages like French, German, using this technique. This technique means the word for word translation, because the French, German sentence structures are completely different. So the structure should match for word for word translation. And because one sentence can be translated literally across languages, does not mean that all sentences can be translated literally. So it doesn't only, I mean, it doesn't mean that all Spanish or all Urdu sentences can be translated literally. It depends. In some sentences can be translated literally, and some cannot be. Right. So literal translation can also denote a translation that represents the precise meaning of the original text but does not attempt to convey style, beauty, or poetry. So literal translation, it can also denote a translation that represents the precise meaning of the original text. This is another, I mean, literal translation and word translation. Maybe it was confusing here, but literal translation can be referred to word by word translation, but it can also denote to a translation that represents the precise meaning of the original text but does not attempt to convey its style, beauty or poetry. It ignores the style, ignores its beauty or poetry, but it represents the precise meaning of the source text. Right. So there is, however, a great deal of difference between a literal translation of poetic work and a prose translation. So there is a great difference between literal translation of a poetic and a prose work. Let's see what's the difference here. A literal translation of poetry may be in prose rather than verse. So the translation of poetry may be in prose rather than in verse in poetry, but also be error free. It may be error free. Okay, so the translation of poetry in prose and there is no error, so it's very difficult, but anyway it's possible. So it can be error free as well, although it's a different genre. I mean, it's not poetry to poetry, but it's poetry to poise, but prose, but it's error free. That's really amazing. Charles Singleton's translation of the Divine Comedy is regarded as a prose translation. You can see this if you find how it's translated and what's the message there. Read it so far. Uh, the source language grammatical constructions are converted to their nearest target language equivalents, but the lexical items are again translated out of context. So in literal translation, here you see the source language grammatical constructions. So grammatical constructions are converted to their nearest target language equivalents, but the lexical items, the vocabulary items, are again translated out of the context. So when they translate the vocabulary, so the context of that vocabulary is not considered in literal translation, but grammatical constructions are converted to the nearest target language equivalence. It means the grammar is taken care as per the target language, but lexical items or vocabulary is translated out of the context. I mean, context is not considered, which is very important in translation. As pre-translation process in literal translation, it indicates problems to be solved. So there are in pre-translation process, there are some problems also which needs to be solved. Literal translation is a translation of all the words of the source text, taking no account of the context but respecting the syntactic structure of the translation. So here there's something interesting here. So that literal translation is a translation of all the words of the source text, but taking no account of the context, but respecting the syntactic structure. Okay, so syntactic structure of the translation, but I mean the grammatical structure of the translation is considered, but context of the source text is ignored in literal translation. Right, so number 3 here, the literary translation. Well, the process of literary translation. It is much more complex and challenging than any other translation. I mean, the literary translation is much more complex and challenging than any other translation. Let's see here some of the characteristics of literary text, and then we will see, I mean, what are the responsibilities of a translator doing literary translation. So every literary text is linked to the literary and cultural tradition of the language in which it is written. So it is literary text is linked to the literary and cultural tradition of the language in which it is written. Okay. Sentences in it are very intimately bound up with the very nature of the language and have their roots deep in the life and habits of the people. The sentences uh, in literary text, they are very closely bound up with the nature of the language, and its roots are very deep in the life and habits of the people. So all these things should be considered when translating any literary text. Moreover, we have some more characteristics of literary text. Words are very rich in their connotative meaning in literary text. So, in addition to the explicit meaning, a literary text contains implicit and suggested meaning, which is equally important. So, there are explicit meaning. A literary text contains implicit meaning and suggested meaning, so which is equally, all these three types of meanings are very important. All right. So the translator has to be prepared for every possible meaning. So this is the responsibility of the translator. I should be prepared for explicit, implicit, or suggested meaning, or any other type of meaning. So you should be well prepared. So literal translation is a translation in which meaning of the source language text is considered most important and hence done on a principle of semantic equivalence. So here in literal translation, so the translation is done on the principle of semantic equivalence, because meaning of the source language text is considered most important. Yeah, the main focus here is on the source language, and that's why the translation is done on the principle of semantic equivalence. A literary translator has his responsibility both to his author and to his reader. I mean, in other words, if you just think a bit deeper, I mean, author means he has responsibility to the author. Author means the source text, and his reader means to the target text. Uh, on the other hand, he has to be faithful to the original with respect to its form, meaning, and style and spirit. So he should be faithful to the original text with respect to its form, the form and the meaning and style and spirit of the source text. So he has to make sure that his translation is in conformity with the linguistic and literary tradition of the target language. So his translation is conform, I mean, it's matching with the linguistic and literary traditions of the target language. So thus the responsibility of the translator working with the literary text is in many ways greater than that of any other translator. I mean, any other type of translator doing any other type of translation other than literal translation. He seems an agent through whom great works of literature pass through the linguistic and cultural barriers. Faithful translation. Faithful translation simply means the translator aims to convey the author's intention of the text as faithfully as possible into the target language. It means the translator aims to convey what the author was intending to communicate as faithfully as possible into the target language. So it attempts, faithful translation attempts to reproduce the precise contextual meaning. So it attempts to reproduce the precise, exact contextual meaning of the original text, the source text, within the constraints of the target grammatical structures. So it attempts to produce the exact contextual meaning, not only the literal meaning, but the contextual meaning of the source text, as well as within the boundaries of the target language grammatical structures. So it doesn't violate the grammatical structures of the target language, and it reproduces the precise contextual meaning. Remember, not the literal meaning only, but it considers the context of the source text as well. It transfers cultural words and preserves the degree of grammatical and lexical abnormality, the deviation from the source language norm in the translation. It transfers cultural words, the context in other words, and preserves the degree of grammatical and lexical abnormality. It preserves the grammatical and lexical correction also, standard also. It preserves the standard of grammatical principles, rules, and lexical rules also. There is no abnormality in grammar or in lexical items, when there is faithful translation. So two important things here so far. So here it transfers cultural words and preserves grammar and lexical abnormality. So there is no problem in grammar and lexic in the translation. It attempts to be completely faithful to the intentions and the text realization of the source language writer. So here, this process, faithful translation, it tries to be completely faithful to the intentions and the text realization, in understanding that text, the hidden meaning of the text of the source language writer. So this is also one of the feature or characteristic of faithful translation. Yes, here we have some of the principles of faithful translation. So these principles are the pillars of this process. Number one, to hold strictly to the author's conception and render faithfully the content of the source language work. So here, the faithful translator holds strictly to the author's conception, what's the concept of the author, and render faithfully the content of the source language work. So whatever the content is there, so he renders it to the target language as much faithfully as possible. Second one, to maintain in the target language version all the structural peculiarities and syntactic organization of the matter under translation. So here the second principle, to maintain in the target language version, in target language version means in the translation, in the product. So it's this process is to maintain what all the structural peculiarities, I mean all structural let's say deficiencies, mistakes, errors, or odd things, and syntactic organization as well, all problems in structure and in syntactic organization of the matter under translation. So this process maintains in translation, I mean keeps all the problems in structure and syntactic organization of the text that is being translated, or that was translated from the source text. 3. To preserve the main stylistic means, including the artistic images and expressiveness of the original work. So here, to preserve the main stylistic means, this is a good work, big work. The stylistic means, to preserve the stylistic means, including the artistic images and impressiveness of the original work. So whatever artistic work or expressiveness is there, or any stylistic means are there in the source text or in the original work, so they are protected or preserved in the faithful translation. 4. Unless required to avoid deliberate omissions, so I mean unless required, so at any cost deliberation omissions should be avoided, enlargements and embellishments must also be avoided, and any other forms of free interpretation of the source work should also be avoided unless they are desperately required. Number 5. To render in the target language version the pragmatic intention of the author and his force of influence on the reader. So this is I think the most difficult task, I mean to render in the target language the version target language version the pragmatic intention, okay, sometimes the pragmatic meaning of the source of the author. I mean he should pass on the pragmatic meaning of the author, source author, okay, and his force of influence on the reader. So he should try his best, level best, to pass on these important concepts in the target text. So these are 5 principles that are observed in the faithful translation as principles. Semantic translation. Number 4. It differs from faithful translation only in as far as it must take more account of the aesthetic value of the source language text, compromising on meaning where appropriate, so that no assonance, wordplay, or repetition jars in the finished version. So I mean there may be some sort of compromising on meaning where appropriate, so that there is no kind of repetition in the final version of the translation. It does not rely on cultural equivalence and makes very small concessions to the readership. So here it doesn't rely on cultural equivalence, so there is a kind of concession to the readership. So like faithful translation is dogmatic, it's a very rigid kind of translation, but semantic translation is more flexible. It seeks to restore the exact meaning of the original. Okay, it seeks to restore the exact meaning of the source text. It follows the syntax and the vocabulary of the source to the point where they slightly distort without, however, violating the standards of the target language text. So it follows the syntax and vocabulary of the source and to the point where they slightly distort. So they slightly distort the syntax and vocabulary, but without, however, not that much that violates the standards of the target language text. There is some kind of distortion, but not up to that level where there is violation of the standards of the target language text. So its quality may be lower than that of the original. Some more characteristics of semantic translation here. Semantic translation resides within its original culture and assists its reader only in communication. Semantic translation is likely to be more awkward, more complex, more concentrated, more detailed, and it processes the thought process irrespective of transmitter's intention. So there may be those intentions are not of the writer, but because the meanings are giving are just implying those thoughts. I mean, his vocabulary or his lexical items, they are implying some sort of thoughts, and semantic translation is actually they just take the semantic meanings, okay, irrespective of pragmatics or reader's intention. So they may also process the thought irrespective of his intentions. Semantic translation is neutral and objective, just to translate naturally. So it's neutral and it's objective, specific, just to translate naturally. So it does not require adding, repairing, or reducing. So it only changes the text force and meaning of source language to the target language. Right, so method number 5, communicative translation. Communicative translation attempts to render the exact contextual meaning of the original text in such a way that both language and content are readily acceptable and comprehensible to the readership. So here the main function of communicative translation is to render the exact contextual meaning of the original text. Okay, so contextual meaning, not the literal meaning. Context, meaning relevant to context. So in such a way that both language, the vocabulary, and the content are, readily or easily acceptable and comprehensible to the target reader. Theoretically, communicative translation presented itself individually to the secondary reader, to the target reader, who does not face obscurities or difficulties, and also expect the liberal transfer of elements into his culture and language where necessary. So here communicative translation, it presented itself to individually to the target reader who does not face any problem, okay, and he also expect the liberal transfer of elements into his culture and language where necessary. So this is a very important function of communicative translation, where the target reader is really at ease and comfort. Communicative translation is considered to be simpler, smoother, clearer, more direct, conventional, tending to under-translate and conforming to a specific register of language. Usually, communicative translation puts emphasis on the shift of messages. So, main emphasis of communicative translation is to communicate the message, shift the message from one language to the other language. The method pays attention to the listener or the reader of target language and hopes that it does not contain any difficulty in the text of the target language. So this is the quality of this method, that it pays special focus, special attention, okay, to the listener or the reader of the target language, and hopes that there is no difficulty in the text of the target language for the target listener or the reader. It seeks to achieve the same effect on the reader of the source language and the target language. So it seeks, it doesn't ignore, it doesn't forget the source reader as well. So it seeks to achieve the same effect on both the readers of the source language as well as the target language. So its quality can sometimes be even better than that of the original. So these were the characteristics of communicative translation. So here let's see a bit comparison of communicative and semantic translation. Communicative and semantic translation well coincides, where the text provides a general meaning rather than a culture bound message, and the matter is as much important as manner. Next, in the translation of important philosophical, scientific, artistic, and religious texts, it is assumed that second reader is more interested than the first. I mean, the target reader is more interested than the first one, the source reader. Communicative and semantic translation is able to fulfill the two aims. Number one, the accuracy, and the second are general. Alright. So number 6, we have idiomatic translation. An idiom, also is called idiomatic expression, is an expression, word or phrase that has a figurative meaning conventionally understood by native speakers. So generally, normally, so idioms are understood by native, or let's say near native speakers. This meaning is different from the literal meaning of the idiom's individual elements. So I mean, everybody understands that in idioms, what the words say, okay, there is hidden meaning behind those words, and that meaning is quite different than the apparent meaning in idioms. In other words, idioms do not mean exactly what the words say. So the words say different, but the idioms say different. The important feature of idiomatic translation is that idiomatic translation refers to achieving a target text that sounds natural in the target language, while idiomatic expressions are idioms or fixed expressions in a given language. So this is very something very special, that idiomatic translation tries to achieve the target text that sounds natural in the target language against the idiomatic expressions or idioms which are fixed expressions in a source language. So in idiomatic translation, the target text reflects the exact message of the source text in a manner that is naturally expressed in the target language. So here you see, so in idiomatic translation, the target text reflects the exact message of the source text in a manner that is naturally expressed in the target language. It means that the message would be the same, but maybe the words are different. So I think I've given you example, no, maybe somewhere else, that there is an idiom in English, yes, not in Urdu. A bird in hand is better than 10 in the bush. So a bird in hand is better than 10 in the bush. So here, once I mentioned in my class in Arab. So they know Arab. Actually, they are Arab. So when I asked them, "Do you know this idiom?" They said, "No, we don't know, but we have a different. We say it like that. That in Arabic, they said it in Arabic. I will not say in Arabic because you may not understand it. So they said that a bird in hand is better than 2 in the tree. Sorry, than 10 in the tree. A bird in hand is better than 10 in the tree. So this is the idiom, but actually the meaning is the same here. I mean, the words are different, but the meaning, the message is the same. So in this way, idiomatic, I mean, this is the target of the idiomatic translation, okay, to reflect the exact message of the source text in a manner that seems natural in the target language. Okay, idiomatic translation, it reproduces the message of the original means the source text, but there is possibility to distort nuances of meaning by preferring colloquialism and idioms where these do not exist in the original. So where the equivalents are not available, so there is possibility of distorting the nuances of meaning in this in idiomatic translation. Looking at the dictionary, this dictionary definition, thanks to Google, they say it comes as no surprise that idioms are difficult to translate. In other words, the only way to know what an idiom means is to know the idiom. So there is the only one way. So what does idiom means? So the only way that to know the idiom. So if you know the idiom, their very nature means that you can't work out the meaning of the phrase from the phrase alone. I mean, if you break the idiom in different phrases, you can understand the medium. You should know the whole medium to understand its meaning. The structure and grammar rules of target language are followed in order to express the message of the source language without carrying source language forms into our final text. So here, this is very important point about idiomatic translation, that and in this process the structure and grammar rules of target language are followed in order to express the message of the source language. In this process, the form uh, or structure of the source language is not carried in the final text, in the final product. In the final product means in the translation. So this is, you can say, this is a kind of target language biased translation. So where source language forms are not very much considered. This will result in a translation that communicates the message of the source text most clearly and naturally into the target language, so that the translation is easy to read and understand. Here we have detailed the three simple steps that are needed to follow the translation uh, of idioms. Number one, identify the idiom. Well, this sounds fairly obvious, but it isn't always that easy. I mean, identify. You think you read uh, an idiom, or you listen to an idiom and you understand it right away. No, that is not easy always. Sometimes very difficult. And step two, understand the meaning of the idiom. You should understand the meaning of the idiom. Number three, find an equivalent idiom in the target language. So these are three steps to translate idioms from source language to the target. Number seven, free translation. Free translation is a method to deliver the intended meaning of the source text without paying attention to details such as syntax, style, and so on of the original text. So there is no role of the original text or the source text. A free translation is suitable in case the translation is difficult to be understood or accepted by the readers, or the translation seems not as attractive or powerful as the original text by approach of literal translation. So if literal translation fails to take the translation up to that powerful or attractive level, then free translation technique is applied to take the translation up to that level where it can be understood and accepted. Free translation is a translation that reproduces the general meaning of the original text, right? So it is a translation that reproduces the general meaning of the original text. General meaning of the original text. Uh, Next, it may or may not closely follow the form or organization of the original. So it may follow closely the form of the original, the source text, or not. It's not necessary. It's free. Uh, it produces the matter without the manner, or the content without the form of the original. So it reproduces the matter without the manner. There's no method, no principle, but for it deals with the matter, the content, or in other words, so it deals with the content without the form of the original, form structure of the original. Usually it is a paraphrase much longer than the original. So I mean, it, for example, in one sentence, there is source text is one sentence, but in free translation, it there may be several sentences for that one sentence, because free translation, so it's just explaining the message. It's a paraphrase type of interpretation. It's a kind of interpretation rather than translation, I guess. Okay, adaptive translation. This is the freest form of translation, mainly used for plays and poetry. Themes, characters, plots preserved, source language culture converted to target language culture, and text is rewritten. Okay, adaptation translation is about communicating meaning through adapting the translation for a particular market or style. You know, there is a difference between adopting and adapting. So adopt means you adopt something, you take something as it is, but adapt, when you have a instead of o after d, so it means that you modify it as per your need. So here now when you read it, adaptation translation is about communicating meaning through adapting the translation for a particular market or style. So when communicating a message to a listener or reader whose mother tongue is not the same as our own, especially when that person does not even understand the language, we must use different ways or methods to get the message across as clearly as possible. So, while we can use gestures, signs, or noises in order to make ourselves understood, when communicating something written, we must turn to translators. So while we can use gestures, signs, or noises in order to make ourselves understood, when communicating something in written, we must, I mean, other things, gestures, signs, noises, so we can do it ourselves. But when something communicating requires written work, so we must turn to translators. Alright, adaptation is one of the tools used in translation. It's used in many cases as cultural differences between different speakers can cause confusion that can sometimes be tricky to understand or simply prevent us from understanding each other. Adaptation is not to be confused with localization. Localization is different than adaptation. So, however, uh, which is used when the target audience speaks a different variant of the same language, such as in the case of Latin America. When adapting a message, we are not translating it literally. This does not mean, however, that when adapting a message or idea, we are being unfaithful to the original message, or that we are not doing our job well. We are not translating it at all. Simply, there are situations in which it is required. So there are some certain situations and when we require adaptation. British scholar Peter Newmark defines adaptation, taken from Vinay and Darbilnet, as the use of a recognized equivalent between two situations. It is a process of cultural equivalence. Dear Sir, Moisinar, Mayo, yours faithfully, and these are some of the examples in different languages. So, adaptation, also known as free translation, are when the translator substitutes cultural realities or scenarios for which there is no reference in the target language. So, when there is no reference in the target language, so translator substitutes cultural realities or scenarios, okay, freely by adapting something. A simple example would be translating Friday 13th. Friday 13th, yeah, this is from English into Spanish. So, how would be, I mean, it looks very simple that, I mean, when you say, okay, translate Friday the 13th in Urdu or in any other language. But in case of Spanish, it's very interesting. So in this case, we would need to adapt the translation. We need to adapt. So here we are adapting the translation to cultural reality of Spanish speaking word and translate it as Martis 13, which means Tuesday the 30th. Maybe it's difficult to understand, but because of the cultural reality of certain community, okay, so this is only this is the solution, that instead of Friday 30th, so this will be translated as Tuesday the 30th. Okay, adaptations are equivalents and can be seen more clearly in the translations of TV shows or movies, where conversations or cultural references must be adapted for foreign audiences. Uh, when comparing translation and adaptation, we are comparing two ways of communicating a message. Here we are comparing translation and adaptation. So it means we are comparing two ways of communicating a message. We can communicate a message through translation, or we can communicate a message through adaptation. So in many cases, it is impossible to translate a text without making an adaptation. See, in many cases, impossible to translate the text without making an adaptation, as a literal translation of the message would cause a loss of all or part of the meaning for the target language. I mean, if we try for literal translation, in that case, okay, where adaptation is must, in that case we would lose uh, all or part of the meaning for the target audience. The target audience won't understand it in its full sense as it is in the source text. It is important to know when to adapt a message. So this is important, when to adapt a message, when an expression might have a more appropriate equivalent for a given situation. So this is important that we know when to adapt a message, and when an expression might have a more appropriate equivalent for a given situation. And when, I mean, we should know, I mean, here we do not need adaptation because we have more appropriate equivalent instead of adaptation, and we should also know that there is no other way than adaptation. So this makes us better translation professionals. So this will be this will improve our translation rank. uh, Now we are in our part 2, that is translation skills. So I understand I've been sitting for quite a long time, but anyway, just a little more and we will be done. Translations, actually, why is translation a skill? Let's talk about this first. Translation is a skill because many problems in translation, including the linguistic and the cultural, depend on practice. Second, translation theory cannot teach a translator to write well, but it can provide training to acquire the skill needed for achieving accuracy and economy, which are the two main aims of translation. Here, I mean, in every skill you need practice. Okay, in every skill you need practice. Only theories cannot teach you how to play cricket or football, so you have to get into the field to master that skill. Here we have some of the skills that a translator needs at his fingertips. Project management, language and literacy, communication, making decisions, information technology, and cultural understanding. Uh, Project management, for example, he should resource coordination, he should be expert in this, and terminology research. I mean, he should be good at researching the terminologies required or needed in the translation process. Administration, I mean, if there is a project of translations, I mean, he should know how to run the administration of that project and how to maintain the quality of the project. Language and literacy, understanding of the source language. So this is also very important. I think we talked in our first lecture that the understanding of the source language. For example, our source language is Urdu, mother tongue is Urdu. So and we do not understand it in deeply. So if we do not understand the source meaning, how can we transfer it to the target language correctly? So understanding of the source language is very important. Okay, we should understand the source language as much as possible for better performance in translation. Writing skills in the target language. So writing skills in the target language, we should master this skill also. Level of translation, decoding and encoding. In here, so we should decode. What we do decode is the source language. I mean, we decode the meaning first. What's written in source language, we should understand. Well, this understanding means decoding. We are decoding this information. First, we decode, and then we encode it into the text language. So we should master these two things. So level of translation, decoding and encoding. Proofreading and editing. So at the end, okay, so a translator must check the spelling and grammar. You know the process of proofreading. You proofread if there are any mistakes, errors, spellings, grammar mistakes, and everything. I mean, you should be able to do it. You should be good at these skills. Communication. I mean, communication for your projects. Okay, uh, you may need to talk to many people, different firms, different clients. Okay, and different concerned people. So clarity of expression is also very important skill. So by using clear and simple words and structure in your translation and in your communication as well, both, and establishing rapport, make a relationship. Like a rapport here also, I think you can have here a twofold meaning here. Rapport with as a business point of view, rapport with your business partners or business relevance. Okay, you should have good relationship with them. You should know how to make relationship with different experts, different professors, different translators, freelancer translators, and so on. So you should have good rapport. I mean, and second thing, you should have good rapport of between the two languages as well. You can say, I mean, you should know the the chemistry of both the languages. Giving and processing feedback. Okay, how you should know how to give feedback if you're taking work from somebody. You should know how to give effective specific feedback. And processing feedback also, I mean, if you receive feedback from somewhere, okay, so how to respond to this, how to process that feedback, or if you giving feedback to someone, I mean, how to follow up that feedback. All these things are included in giving and processing feedback. Listening and questioning, you should know this is a very important skill actually. I mean, if you're a good listener, okay, you should be a good questioner as well. Not questionnaire, but questioner. I mean, you should know how to question. What questions should I ask? There is saying that if you know one question, it's better than 1,000 answers. So listening and questioning, I mean, you should be able to to listen from the experts, and you should be able to question them also, so that, I mean, you can professionally improve uh, day by day. Observing and checking understanding. Okay, observing and checking understanding, so make sure about the understanding of the topic being translated. So you should observe and check the understanding of the topic that is being understood, being translated. Making decisions, sometimes when you have to make decisions about different translation projects. So you need consulting. Sometimes you should be able to consult. I mean, you should not avoid consultation. This is very important. Reflection on your work, you should know. I mean, some reflection is very important actually. It's checked wherever you go. I mean, it depends on reflection. Reflection is very important point. For example, you do something or you write a paragraph, and then you say, for example, that, oh, my paragraph is wonderful, it's excellent piece of work, there's no problem, everything is fine, I deserve 100% marks or 90% marks. And actually there are some problems, so it goes negative against you, because it shows that you are unable to identify the mistakes in this paragraph. So, I mean, you are not a good analyzer, so you lack this skill. So this goes against you. I mean, and it affects the quality of your work as well. So you should be a good reflector. So you should know whatever you do, you should know, oh, here I did good, here I did not good, here I should have done better. Okay, here there is some space of improvement, and here that I was perfect. So if you are good reflector, so it means, I mean, your mind is very open, your vision is open, and that will improve your personality, not only as a translator, but wherever you go. Analyzing and evaluating, this is very near to that. Whatever work is there, so you have to analyze this and you evaluate the work. Okay, and even the work is done by you or by someone else, and establishing facts and making judgments. So all these things are important when you make decisions. So you think, okay, this is a fact, you should be able to accept facts. You should not, I mean, stay stuck to your opinion, which is against the fact. But if something is fact, so you should accept it open heartedly. And making judgments, you should be able to make judgments. Okay, you should not be afraid of making decisions, because decision making is very important. And if you do not make decisions on time, and you waste that time, okay, sometimes it can cost you a lot. So making judgments on time is very important. Information technology, yeah, I mean, this is also important for a translator. So they should know the hardware and software used in producing translations. So They should know the resources that can help him in translation process. Like these are some of the softwares: Al-Wafi, Al-Misbar, Google Translate, or some other, so many other. Electronic file management. The goal of computer file management is to ensure that you can find what you are looking for, even if you're looking for years after its creation. So you should know how to manage your files on your computer, okay, how to organize your stuff there so you can locate even after years. E-commerce consists of the buying and selling on the internet and other computer networks. So you should know also e-commerce, how to deal with this. So it consists of buying and selling on internet and other computer networks. So there may be some further there may be some developments in the softwares or hardwares related to translation. So a translator should be aware of all these things. Cultural understanding: what influences the development of the source language. Okay, what influences the development of the source language. National characteristics where the language is spoken. Hazards of stereotyping. So all these things are important for a translator to know. You will say here what were the methods, I forgot really. Literal or word for word or communicative, right? Semantic, or whatever methods were there, 8 methods. So you write here, and here you write points in bullets, okay, in bullets. So in this way, this will give you an overall picture of all the methods, and I think this will be a proof that you have understood the topic very well. And these assignments in this format of online education are going to be very important, I guess. And maybe they will have a good part in your grading of your final exam. So work hard, do some search, okay, and this is part of your research also. You have to research something, and this will help you in your research work as well. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and I hope you'll forgive me for the delay in your lecture. But now, inshallah, I'll be quick enough, and I'll be onto the work really. So see you again. So inshallah. So tell me how many days do you want for this assignment, and then I will fix the date after your comments. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.